Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall.
Everyone, welcome to this meeting of the Housing Committee. Our main item of business today is going to be estate demolition and refurbishment, and we'll welcome our guests in a moment, but we have got a few other items of business to swiftly deal with first. So item 1, apologies for absence and chair's announcements. Can we have apologies, Laura?
We've received apologies from Andrew Goff, Steve O'Connell and Fiona Twycross. Tony Harbour and Murad Qureshi are attending as substitute members.
Okay, thank you, and welcome to Tony and Murad. So welcome members of the public as well. Can I ask people to switch off their electronic devices or make sure they're switched to silent? And item 2, declarations of interest. Can we note the declarations of interest, and the members have any other interest to declare? No, thank you. Item 3, membership of the committee. Can we note the membership and chairing arrangements for the committee as agreed by the annual meeting of the Assembly on the 14th of May? Thank you. The committee is recommended to note the terms of reference for this committee as agreed by the annual meeting. Item 4, can we note those?
Noted.
Thank you. Item 5, standing delegation. Committee is recommended to note the standing delegation to the chair as agreed by the annual meeting.
Noted.
Item 6, can we agree the minutes of the 25th of March to be signed by myself as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 7. Sorry, there's quite a few of these. It's the first meeting of the municipal year, so we have to speed through all these. But action taken under delegated authority. Can we note the action taken under delegated authority?
Noted.
Thank you. Item 8, welfare reform. Can we note the welfare reform reports?
Noted.
Item 9, the Mayor's affordable housing commitments. Can we note this report?
Noted.
Which then brings us on to item 10, which is our main item of business today. Next, for our next meeting, we're going to have 2 meetings on demolition and refurbishment of London social housing estates. For our next one on the 10th of July, it's going to be a public session with an open mic component, because we're keen to hear from tenants and residents affected by this from across London. So we will be publicising this, but do urge people to come along if they are interested in taking part in that, because we're keen to hear people's views and experiences. But for our first meeting on this topic today, can I welcome Stephen MacDonald, Director of Place for the London Borough of Barnet. Can I also welcome Genevieve Macklin, Head of Strategic Housing from Lewisham. We also have Russell Prophet, former Head of the Peckham Partnership and now CEO for Greenwich Inclusion. Stephen Ross, Asset Management Director for the Southern Housing Group, and Professor Becky Tunstall, Director for the Centre for Housing Policy at the University of York. So welcome to all of our guests this morning. If I can start with you, Becky, which is more commonly undertaken, refurbishment or demolition and rebuild, from the academic studies that you've done?
Well, it depends exactly what you mean by refurbishment,
right,
and how high you set the bar. But really, in any case, there's vastly more refurbishment going on than demolition and rebuild. And it's very annoying because my figures have just vanished from the screen, so I could have quoted good things for you. But if you think of 2012-13, there are at least 300,000 homes in the UK, social rented homes in the UK, that had some substantial work done to them. The figures are a bit confusing. There are up to 800,000 bits of work done to homes, but at least a minimum of 300,000 had things done like boiler replacement, rewiring, new kitchen, so on, part of the Decent Homes programme and following on from that. But when you look at the figures for demolitions, it's much, much smaller. So if you look just in London, about 2,000 homes per year are demolished, and that's in all 10 years.
And are we seeing patterns change over time? Is demolition on the increase, or have you tracked it that way?
Well, one of the really frustrating things about this whole area is there aren't actually brilliant figures on demolition. And it's surprisingly difficult to get really crisp figures to do that sort of subtle measuring. So, for example, I and colleagues a few years ago tried to look at trends in London specifically between 2002 and 2010, and we used the returns that local authorities provide to CLG or DCLG, as it's been variously called, and different bits of information. And we were able to get a minimum figure for demolitions, but then there was also a sort of maximum figure, which was the gap between, which was the difference between the overall change in the number of social homes and those that were known to be bought. So on this very basic issue, there's a bit of vagueness on the figures. But looking at the minimum figures over that period, it's frustrating because my computer's just gone at just the right moment. I think the range was 1,000 to 6,000 council homes have been demolished in London. In London. And the range for London as a whole was somewhere between 9 and 26,000 over that 8-year period. So it's somewhere between 1,000 per year and maybe sort of 3,000 per year.
And is London any different from the national picture in this?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't done that same analysis for the rest of the country, but my feeling is that there are two main rationales for demolishing council housing, and one is a rationale that's based outside London, that's to do with low demand. And obviously that's not the situation in London. So you have some areas outside London where there is quite a lot of demolition, or there has been over the last 10 years, to cope with the real problems of difficult to let housing that's also expensive to manage and refurbish. But I think London is probably the national capital of this other form of demolition, which is demolition linked to regeneration with increases in density and the use of redevelopment for cross-subsidy, obviously because the land values are higher.
Thank you. Just in terms of scene setting, if any of the other guests wish to add to that before we move on to some of the more detailed areas of questioning, Stephen Ross?
No, I don't think I'm anything to add on this, specifically what Becky's been writing.
Russell?
No.
Genevieve?
Yeah, I just think certainly when I was looking at the history of what's gone on in Lewisham, we've had 7 estate regeneration schemes, and 4 of those have been about refurbishment as well as demolishing smaller parts of the estate adjacent to vacant land, and only 3 out of the 7 have been about completely demolishing the whole estate and rebuilding it. So it does seem to support the view that actually there's, and you know, the extent of investment in refurbishment way outweighs the kind of level of demolition and rebuild.
And has there been an emphasis on increasing density as part of refurbishment, or has that just been on the demolition side?
Yeah, on 4 out of those 7, we've doubled densities. Overall, there were originally 2,373 units across those 7 estates, and that's increased to 3,389. So it's about a third increase. There was only 1 estate where the number of units reduced, and that was in a very early phase when it wasn't a requirement of the funding regime to kind of maintain or increase densities.
Okay, thank you. And Steve McDonald?
I would just
point of view.
Similar experience with Genevieve. Just that they're not polar questions, whether you knock down or whether you maintain or refurbish. Typically an estate regeneration will have some combination. It's very rare that you knock down an entire... Well, from experience in London, I was quite interested in that dichotomy you mentioned, that, you know, because I've never worked in a low demand environment, so I couldn't comment on that. But often there is a refurbishment. So, for example, Graham Park, which is one of the estates for which I'm responsible, which is currently about 2,000 units, it will go to something like 3,500, and 1,000 of those will be retained units, but they'll be refurbed.
Okay, Russ.
I'd just say that, unlike the pattern that seems to be prevalent at the moment, the Peckham regeneration was actually about reducing density.
Yes.
And it was about taking units out and replacing what was there to a perceived higher standard.
Could that happen now, given population pressures and so on? And
I think, as Stephen said, criteria is different.
I think the answer simply is no. Because, I mean, Peckham is an interesting case, and I think Peckham is actually, as Russell knows, I know Peckham well, a good example of what we can't really do anymore, because Peckham was done in a high subsidy environment.
Yep.
And we now have to pay for regeneration and rebuilding out of the proceeds of the estate. And so therefore you have to increase density to be able to afford to build the new stock and replace the stock that you're demolishing. So the answer is, you'd have, it's just not going to happen. The maths doesn't work.
Okay, well, thanks each of you for your opening contributions. I'm now going to hand over to Steve.
Thanks. I really want to examine now the sort of the decision making that leads to a decision to either refurbish an estate or to demolish, perhaps in part or in whole, and to rebuild. What are the driving factors that lead to such a decision? Is it entirely about condition, or are there other factors like needing to add units and so on? Genevieve, do you want to sort of start off by commenting on that issue, and then I'll ask others to do as well?
Yeah, I think that question really has to be asked in the broader picture about what you're doing with your assets as a whole. And so if you look at some kind of questions around particular estates may lead to a debate about whether you demolish and rebuild or regenerate. But actually, in Lewisham, when we went back to, there was a housing commission set up in 2000, and a stock condition survey was carried out in that year as well, and that showed that we needed to invest 536 million across the entire housing estate over 10 years to bring it up to the decent home standard, because then it was about meeting the target of decent homes by 2010. That was a government target. We actually had 320 million, so there was a gap of 216 million. So looking at the housing estate as a whole in terms of the options that were available, there were a number. So some of it was about, regenerating estates, perhaps demolishing and rebuilding, looking at what our capital was that we could do with the existing, from investment from our own resources or borrowing, etc. And then there were also options around potentially stock transfer, private finance initiative, etc. So the regeneration question, demolish and rebuild, was kind of looked at in the context of all of that.
It was partly about raising money to deal with your condition issue.
Well, some of it was, I think when we looked at the 7 estates that we did end up regenerating, that was a mix of issues that were considered. Some of it is that they were not well-functioning estates. They were in areas of scoring highly on the multiples of deprivation. They were also lots of crime and antisocial behaviour. There were concentrations of monotenure estates. The level of investment required in some of those estates was so high that to just, keep putting money at them was not seen as kind of financially the best option going forward. So in discussions with residents, it was about, on some of them, and a lot of them, do we kind of demolish parts or whole of the estate and rebuild? So there were, and also there were funding pots available. There was a single regeneration funding pot, there was the estate action funding pot. So lots of those over the years were available.
So is this funding that was available if you were demolishing and rebuilding, but not if you were refurbishing?
Well, it was a mix, actually.
Right.
So some of those funding pots we used to do both. Okay. So and so whatever funding is available does kind of produce questions over what you might do with your whole of your asset base as well. So it's a mix of all of those things, really. And then obviously in discussions with residents, it's important what they want and how they feel about where they're living, what sort of levels of investment they want. And so a lot of it was resident-led in Lewisham around what the residents wanted as well, and fitting that within the funding regime.
But I think you're telling me that the underlying issue here was the stock condition and the need to meet the decent home standard and the overall cost of...
There was certainly a need to invest. There'd been years and years and years of lack of investment, so that's why the decent home standard was brought in and funding was available for that. So yeah, there was certainly a need to kind of catch up on a backlog of investment requirements. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Stephen, do you want to...
Yeah, no, I will. I'll land at Barnet, which is where I work now, but I'll just draw on some of the other experience. Genevieve's example of actually looking at in many respects, the Decent Homes programme, clunky in many respects, was actually very good at galvanising authorities to do that sum. What is the liability, the maintenance liability? How much have we got to fix that liability over the next, within the period that we've got, and what's the gap and what can we do about it? And that was quite a motivation in Southwark, where I was responsible for regeneration. It was quite a motivation. It was certainly the thing that got regeneration happening in Hackney under my watch, that clearly there just wasn't enough money to make the sums stack. So in a sense, came to the problem with a view to refurbing and maintaining, realising that the maths doesn't work, and then thinking about what else can you do, because you've actually got an asset, and can you make that asset work for you in a different way? And so that kind of motivates you to start looking at regeneration, looking at densification, and basically releasing the value in the land, and that works particularly well in central London authorities. I think if I can move to Barnet and just use some tangible examples, it almost ranges across some of the things Jeremy said and perhaps others. Dollis Valley, which we're currently redeveloping as a regeneration estate, absolutely built in the 60s, late 60s and the 60s, beyond its asset life, poorly built, leaking heat. The tenants didn't like it, so we are doing some refurb, but mostly a rebuild, and so that was the maintenance liability. The numbers stacked even in a fairly relatively low value area. The deprivation thing, the large mono estate is the motivation behind regenerating Graham Park, because it's a very large estate and it's very inward-looking, Radbone kind of design. Everything sort of looks in. People, many of these residents on the estate never leave the estate because it's sort of one of those. It's almost a vortex for some people, and we wanted to break that up and get the sort of diversity that comes with regeneration. At Brain Cross, where we have a relatively small estate, about 300 units, Whitefield, that's very much about placemaking. So we're going to be knocking that entire estate down to be able to create space to be able to build a new town centre. So it's a different motivation altogether. And finally, we have a number of smaller estates, sort of 50 to 100 unit size, and we've already started with one of those at actually very standard kind of design, in particularly middle ring and outer ring London, where in the 60s again they built tower blocks and then left an awful lot of space around them. And in this, where we're looking for space to build council and affordable housing, that's a really good place to go. So we've started to do that. So it's actually, we're doing a refurb and regeneration job on a few of those estates to get additional affordable housing. So it's sort of the infill on a large scale. So at least 4 reasons there, just to share with you.
Russell?
Yeah, well, the Peckham experience, again, is rather different because it was more of the place-shaping variety that Stephen was talking about, rather than assets in terms of housing. It was a wider perspective. It was the area experienced disproportionately all of the negativities that you can imagine around crime, around education, around employment, around the local economy. And there was a political desire to make a difference. And as a result, Well, I'm happy to do that if the chair wants me to continue.
If we can, so the next meeting there's going to be plenty of opportunity for public participation. So we are having an open mic session at our July meeting. This one is not. So through the chair, please.
Right. So all I'm making the point really is that the context was different. The housing issues, where it came in as a driver, was a high turnover of residencies and a relatively low demand to take up residency on the units that were becoming vacant, so the asset was simply withering away. Therefore, there seemed a reason from a housing point of view, as well as from an economic point of view, to go for regeneration of the neighbourhood and to use a more holistic approach. In statistical terms, it was an SRB grant of about 60 million, which at the end of the day had generated an overall spend of some 300 million because of investment that was brought in through housing associations and the private housing sector, who were offered the opportunity to try to create what didn't exist in Peckham before, which was a private housing market. And that has been created and held in terms of changing the whole dynamics of the neighbourhood. So it was a different scheme to the ones that you can probably get today.
And Stephen?
Yes, the example I was asked to talk about really, which is one that I was deeply involved with, was a small, by any of these comparisons, very small redevelopment project in Islington, the Market Estate in Islington, a 271 unit estate, finished in only 1968, so again quite a modern estate. But by the time the late 90s has occurred, Islington had spent some money trying to do some refurbishment to it, taking link blocks down and so on. It hadn't worked. The antisocial behaviour, prostitution, all these kind of things that affected both the estate and the park adjacent to it was still pretty rife. It's just north of King's Cross, so the work that's been happening in King's Cross has driven out the antisocial behaviour from King's Cross, the areas around there, and Market Estate was a sort of stopping point just north of there. So it suffered very badly. Locally, a lot of stigma, a lot of anxiety about the community more widely. It's adjacent to, it's the second largest open space, Caledonian Park. So what had happened was a number of incidents occurred. The kids firebombed the new concierge facility one night in about the late 1990s, which had not been properly commissioned. And that went up in smoke, and that was £250,000 worth of damage done. And the council, we can't afford to invest. We're going through a time when boroughs like Islington were starved of funding and had no capital money available to them. And then a young boy was killed when a security door fell on him on one of the corridors. And this then galvanised the residents, so we can't put up with this anymore. And so that they, with the council, decided the best way forward was a redevelopment programme. And we were then invited through the process of a stock transfer to get involved. And it was interesting actually, because structurally, and I think this is interesting, structurally there was nothing wrong with the buildings, they were sound structurally. There were leaks and the usual lack of maintenance and so on, but if you hadn't got that backstory and that around it, you could have said, well, 271 homes, is it worth trying to save them? But in fact, the view was taken before we actually came on the scene that was not the case. But what I think was interesting about the Market Estate, which I think is different to many others, is there was a real determination to keep that community together, so to retain the social value of the estate. So we had to put together quite a complex programme of building and decanting and keeping the whole community together. And that was quite interesting, actually, for a long-term housing practitioner, as I am, to actually keep a community together. And we reconfigured the park. As a consequence of funding we had to release, we spent nearly £1 million improving Caledonian Park. We were allowed to build partially onto the park. As long as the end of the story, the public parks had lost no acreage, so we reconfigured it. And we increased the density from 271 to 421, a mixed tenure estate. We kept the same number of social rented units in 271. That was quite interesting, but we sold 89 units across subsidised. I mean, whether that would happen again, I don't know, because it was born of a time when boroughs were not able to raise capital. They couldn't go to fund in that way. So the only way was transferred out of public ownership in a way into a social registered landlord housing association. So we were able to raise funds and do the work ourselves. It's a very interesting project, I think, a very small one, way below the scale of anything we've discussed so far. But I think it's a microcosm of the fact that although normally we say it's driven by structural condition of buildings and so on, this was, I think, driven by a number of issues. They were part of it. Design was part of it. It was really, by today's standards, it wouldn't be a design you'd want to replicate. But that wasn't, I don't think, possibly the fundamental issue there.
Sorry, just a minute, Stephen. I'll bring you back in a minute. But previous piece of work this committee did was on new build council housing, and one of the key recommendations of that was to government to either lift or substantially increase the borrowing cap on local authorities. If that recommendation was implemented, we could be looking at quite a different regime in terms of refurbishment versus demolition, couldn't we?
Oh, indeed. I mean, that's why I think there are so many variables here. It's the context of the site, the location, the place it is. It's the demands of the residents. whether they want to live there or don't want to live there and how they're feeling. It's a whole range of financial then attributes you put against it, the value of the land as it is, the value it could be, whether or not there's investments needed for the property or not. A whole range. I mean, the other interesting idea about Market Estate, and I draw this again, immediately next door at the same time, opened in the same years, in the 60s, is a City of London Corporation estate called the York Way Estate, which is still going strong today. It's now it's now 50 years old. More than half it has gone right to buy. The City Corporation have continued to invest continuously through the estate. It's of the same pattern design as Market Estate in many ways. Here we've had to replace an estate with £50 million investment. That, because it had continuous investment throughout its 50 years, it stands today and is a testament to that design idea and the concepts that were there. So that's quite interesting, I think. So a lot of it is to do with the way funding works throughout the life, its management and maintenance consistently over its life. So in a way you could say the Market Estate was lost through lack of that investment. Consistent investment over its 40 years, whereas the estate immediately next door has been retained and will continue on.
Because the same design, you're saying?
Very similar design, very similar. The same, the large underground car park, the large open space, the estate's built on stilts, scissor-type block, masonette blocks, all those kind of 1960s designs which are considered very worthy at the time and built on good ideas in the day's day.
Nevertheless, you clearly felt that by replacing one design with a different design, that you could solve some of the problems associated with the first design. What's been the outcome, if you like? Because presumably long term you might find that the new design is not maintained properly and over the long term, etc.
I mean,
are those kind of issues that existed before going to return, or do you think there's something inherently better about the new design?
I think we've obviously interestingly, I mean, there's so many stories here, but essentially yes, we've designed it very much with a traditional street pattern. We've gone back to a very traditional Islington street pattern. Simple roads, simple back garden, front gardens or front patios, private back gardens secure and so on. So we've lost all that semi-public open space, which was the kind of problem, one of the major problems. Much more natural surveillance, many front doors on the actual road frontage, and much more active road frontages. So we've removed, if you like, a major problem, which was this large areas of open, unpoliced estates, access galleries and so on, which created a haven for nefarious activities throughout the whole estate. So we've gone back to a much more traditional design. Interestingly, because it was a stock transfer, we had to get the residents obviously had to vote for the whole thing to go through. We had to, in the offer document, we had to put together our proposals for design and so on. So we did a lot of work with the residents on that. And what was very interesting is the architects, the master planning architects we employed with the residents to look at the scheme, came up with some quite interesting ideas. But very much once you got the residents involved, they wanted to go for traditional design. I think that's very interesting. They did not want something that looked 21st century. Their view was, we've lived in a 1960s experiment, we can see around us in Islington traditional streets and properties that go back through literally the centuries. That's what we want to live in. We don't want to live in these modern, iconic buildings which the architects have played with. We want actually traditional design. And that, I think, was very interesting. So that constrained, because we had to win a ballot, in a way that did constrain the design that we could build to. As it did, I think the design works quite well. It'll never win awards, in terms of it'll never win an RIBA award and so on. It's very traditional. But I think it creates its place. It creates a very nice setting. There's an elaborate clock tower which is the centre of the Caledonian cattle market that is now sits in a crescent, whereas it was just a gap in the building you could see it. So we've done quite a lot, I think, in design terms, but it's not a cutting-edge design in that sense. It's returning to much more natural street surveillance, natural traditional street scenes.
Would you say that one lesson from this is that where you've got lots of communal space, that it has to be maintained to a very high standard if it's going to work as communal space? You've got to invest in it, in other words, on an ongoing basis. You can't afford to, because communal space often, when it's neglected, becomes worse than worse than nothing.
Yes, I mean, as I say, it is that consistent investment that has to come through, and part of the way we fund these things it makes it very much, for local authorities particularly, it's very hard because they have to incur the costs of these things. They have to recover those costs, and if they're not in the public realm, they're seen as part of the housing realm, then they have to be funded through service charge or whatever. This puts costs up and adds significantly. It's not on the public rates, as it were. The public doesn't share the costs of those spaces in the way they do public parks and so on. So all of that plays into the issue very much.
And Becky?
I just wanted to make a few general observations. I think from the point of view of local authorities, when it comes to decision making about the overall assets and estate, one thing we've got to bear in mind is there are a lot of non-options, and people have spoken about the different financial regimes that have been available from central government over different periods of time and the extent to which that's really driven decision making. Then to make a more detailed point about the use of densification to create private housing and cross-subsidise, I think it's worth bearing in mind that that's a policy that really only works very successfully in London and the South East, and it didn't work successfully from 2008 for a few years, and there were a lot of schemes that became stalled and stuck. So really, although that is at the moment sort of the main national policy, that you should just use your assets as best you can, it's not a very sustainable or sort of well thought out national policy. In a way, London is in a special position to be able to make use of it, but perhaps should show some solidarity with other places that can't, arguably. When it comes to decision making about whether an estate has gone too far, whether it's going to be throwing good money after bad to try and refurbish it, I think that's where things get very, very difficult. And there are some examples we can all think of where the decision making is quite straightforward and easy, but there are a lot of cases where the balance was much finer, and then it all comes down to sort of technicalities, the accounting work that's done to work out cost benefit. And I've got to say, from a sort of outsider's point of view, trying to understand processes that have gone on in your boroughs and to try and research these things, it is very difficult to find a sort of a decision-making trail. It's very difficult to find the key documents, the key assumptions that were made. You know, there is an issue there about transparency, but there may be an underlying issue about, you know, what the nature of the process itself. What were the key assumptions? Did they drift over time as new things emerged? And, you know, inevitably there is some of this, but I think we do need to think really about trying to make that process as explicit as possible so that assumptions can be challenged, or when new information comes up, it's clear why a change has been made in the decisions. And once you start thinking about things in that way, it's, you know, sadly and obviously revealed that quite a lot of the key information that people need to make these decisions is just not available. And there are, you know, serious gaps in what's going on. I mentioned how we don't even know how many homes have been demolished in London. That's obviously a big gap, but there are other very important data gaps. And Stephen, you mentioned, you know, what were the outcomes of the market redevelopment. We don't comprehensively know the outcomes of most of these schemes because there hasn't been time or money to go back and find out comprehensively were the goals achieved. You know, one very simple thing, there's a lot of concern about the existing residents, a lot of concern about making sure that their situation is bettered, they have a right to return if they want to, and so on. But there's never in the UK been the kind of tracking study that's actually followed people to find out what's happened to them. If they moved off, did they move back? You know, there's some information, but never anything comprehensive to find out where they've all gone and what happened and if those goals were achieved. So, you know, serious gaps there. And, you know, on issues like, you know, whether you can do something with the market estate, whether you can secure it or not, there are so many uncertainties, and any sum you do is going to be ever so sensitive to a huge number of variables. And I'm sure there have been some schemes in the past where there's been a little cooking of the books to push things one way or another. But however you try, there's always going to be that issue that putting different numbers in can produce wildly different results. So there's a real art to this process of looking at cost benefit. It's not just a science.
Given the amount of money involved in all these decisions, that strikes me as a huge gap in our knowledge, that we're not actually going back and examining the outcomes. Perhaps that could be something we could look at in our recommendations.
I wouldn't trouble yourself too much with that, if I may suggest, because each scheme is so different. I mean, I just think this isn't the thing that lends itself to aggregate data, because I don't think it would actually help you understand it that much more. Because not only is each scheme different and will be motivated by different reasons why it was actually set up, but it will also be at different times in the housing cycle. So your point is well made about the variables change around. So, the nature of regeneration estates, by definition, if it's a regeneration estate, it's not viable. If it was viable, you wouldn't need it to be, the market would sort it out. You wouldn't need to find a way to play the numbers. So, none of us on this side of the table would be sitting here talking to you about estates that didn't need some form of, whether it's cross-subsidy or subsidy or whatever, because one way or another, there are regeneration estates that the cost is greater than the amount of money you're going to make out of them. So you've got to find a way to play the tune. And that tune changes as the market changes. I mean, a classic one, we don't need to go very far. And, I probably shouldn't put my hand up for this, but I have to admit to my less successful schemes, well, my successful things. But, I was responsible for both Aylesbury and the Elephant and Castle. And then the market tanked. So, I managed to empty the Haygate estate in just over a year, won an award for that, and then, of course, nothing happened. And, that's why people get very upset about regeneration. Yeah, you say, Shane. I'm explaining why. So the market tanks, and the assumptions on which that's based, so it goes back to your very point, and the market values you thought you might be able to achieve no longer exist, and everything has to wait for the market. And that's one of and this goes to your point, and I would support the point about the lack of sustainability in a model that relies on private sector values to support public's refurbishing and redeveloping public housing, because it only works while the market's buoyant. And so we ought to have if there's anything that policy should be looking at, it's actually what happens when. Because invariably what always happens, I've been around this business long enough, invariably what happens is we all get hooked. We all go, oh, this is the solution. And then it stops being the solution, and then governments go into this, oh my goodness, what are we going to do now mode? And then they start coming up with all sorts of quick solutions, when in fact what we should be doing is this is what the market does. This is what the market does. And if we want to continue to refurbish and improve public housing in this country, we need to know that in the good times we can perhaps rely on the market and in certain locations. And when the things don't go well, we need to have a fallback position, which is effectively a subsidy position. I don't understand why it takes so long to learn that basic lesson. I don't think we need data to tell us that. I just think that is the facts.
Can I just, sorry, Joe,
yes,
can I just add, because I realise I spoke very much in general terms and didn't refer specifically to some of the estates we've regenerated, but to corroborate really that point around kind of being able to audit trail and understand how decisions are made and on what basis they're made. I think it is difficult to do that for precisely the reasons that Stephen's pointed out, how there are so many variables impacting over time, and government policy changes and financial changes in the market, etc. So one example I would give you of one of our estates is the very famous Excalibur estate, which is an estate of 180 prefabs, which were built post-war to last for 10 years or 15 years and are still there kind of 50, 60 years later. And everything about them, they're riddled, they're built out of asbestos essentially. They've got no eco value, you know, they kind of can't be heated, they overheat in the summer, they're freezing in the winter. You know, most of the estate, you know, are desperate to get off it, but, you know, they've got lots of kind of garden area and lots of space, and there's some of the residents that are deeply attached to their homes and have done a lot of work with them. But they do not work, these prefabs do not work now, let alone going on into the future. So the cost of doing anything with those would way outweigh, you know, kind of trying to sustain them, any kind of attempt to try and keep them and preserve them. So, you know, just the construction, etc., of them would mean that actually there aren't a lot of choices around. So, you know, we have, and we will be doubling the density of that estate. And so that is an example of where, you know, the investment, the structure doesn't work, and, you know, the costs of doing anything with them going on into the future and even now is prohibitive. So you look at a different solution, which is about demolishing and rebuilding. But then there are other estates equally. Most of them, actually, most of the other estates that we've regenerated are in the north of the borough, which was always seen to be very monotenure, and like I say, in areas of high deprivation. And so some of that was about doing, you know, what others have mentioned here, bringing in a better mix to make the whole areas more sustainable. And they were linked with kind of some town centre regeneration schemes as well. So it wasn't just about the estates, it was about the areas and the places, and making sure that the estates could integrate better with the wider environment in which tenants were living, so they didn't feel like they were isolated from the rest of the community, like the Peaks estate, huge estate. So part of that was demolished, not all of it, part of it. There was a tower block that was sold off, there was a film, a programme, a series all about it, etc., and changing that. And some of the decisions that kind of influenced that was, actually, if we bring in some people with more disposable income, they'll spend the income in the area, that will help for everybody who's living in the area. That didn't actually happen because the retail and the wider economic offer wasn't enough to make that happen on that single estate. But nevertheless, the riverfront of that whole estate has changed substantially over the years. So there's, you know, just going back to that original point about a mix of reasons for why you might want to decide to regenerate an estate, and the audit trail around it and the decision making around it, it's difficult for it to be clear because the terms will always change, you know, given the context of policy changes and the kind of economic market within which we're operating.
Tom, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just briefly, I was going back to what Becky said earlier about cross-subsidy, and that, you know, this is what the government's encouraging, and it might work in bits of London, but it doesn't work in the rest of the country. But doesn't this just show that, you know, the government needs to free up local authorities to be able to pursue whatever schemes they need to pursue that's best for their areas, rather than trying to impose some sort of national template?
Well, there is a national template, which is this policy, yes. And I would agree that one of the big problems in British housing policy is it's not sensitive enough to the diversity of markets all around the country. But the point remains that if the only way to get funding for improving very expensive to improve estates is through demolition and cross subsidy, you're cutting out a lot of options.
Which again goes back to the need to lift the borrowing cap.
Yeah.
Murad,
just on the borrowing, I mean, if and when local authorities are freed up to do that, I mean, can we see a lot of local authorities opting to refurbish their estates rather than building them new? Is that likely to be a scenario in which Russell?
It depends on the context, and part of the difficulty of trying to track all of this is that each area will have its own local political dynamic. And as you've heard on the Islington experience, it very much is working with the grain of the local community that you end up with successful outcomes. You can't impose a model. And that's where I think the government's often going wrong. I certainly think local authorities should have more freedom and flexibility, and that would help to meet their general objectives of improving the quality of housing. But it very much will then depend on the local circumstances, and that will help to limit what you can and can't do.
I understand what you're saying, but I mean, you can imagine councils packed full of councillors that go to surgeries with residents coming in, complaining about this, that and the other. One of the biggest complaints is usually the state of the estates. They're going to have to respond, and there's a way of doing that electorally, more so than, dare I say, building newer places. And I suspect there'll be more responses to that than people realise.
And then it depends on the freedoms and flexibilities the authority as a whole has to try to respond to those pressures. We're operating in a constrained environment at the present, so it'll always be, as the Lewisham story shows, trying to match what you can do with the options that's available, and very much in context of the priorities that you have to make. You can't do everything.
Okay, we're going to come on to some detailed questions later on the financing regime, but for the moment we'll be looking at some of the other factors that need to be taken into consideration, environmental criteria, sustainability and so on. Murad's going to lead off on questioning on
yes,
that.
That's true. I think someone used the term sustainability, I think wrongly, because I think you used it in the financial context. Can we use it in an environmental context? I mean, when these considerations of the various options are discussed, how often are environmental considerations taken on board? Becky?
Well, from my point of view, from my experience of a range of schemes, obviously not as intimate as the other guests here today, environmental issues do come up, but it's a little bit idiosyncratic depending on perhaps the sort of culture of the local authority and whether residents are raising those issues. But they don't tend to make it into a formal cost-benefit analysis or a sort of formal environmental accounting analysis. That tends to be that there's some thought about mitigating, making some sort of gesture towards mitigating the environmental impact of knocking down and starting again, which it does seem, rather resource-intensive. So, for example, there might be some thought about, extremely careful thought and hard work put into reusing rubble as hardcore, those sort of things. But I would say a minor consideration, and perhaps a case in point, going back to my previous point about how, in most cases, there isn't a visible formal cost-benefit analysis done. And picking up on your word sustainable, I think we can look at it in all kinds of dimensions. So if you look at a state and you're making decisions about what's happening in the next year, you'll make very different decisions to if you think about 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. But it's not always clear in which time frame people are looking at for different sorts of things. And also what else needs to be in place to ensure the sustainability of whatever will be redeveloped. I mean, if we were able to start afresh with policy, we'd want to have a setup where estates didn't get into the position where you're forced to, really think hard about what to do with them. And why is it that happens? At Market Estate, there was an issue about management, maintenance, caretaking, those sort of things. So, again, thinking about sustainability more broadly, but environmental sustainability too, so we can avoid doing this all over again. When new places are built, we need to build in a legacy of sustained caretaking or whatever it might be. And this can really impact people's lives. I've met quite a few people whose homes have been demolished twice in their lives, or even 3 times in their lives, because they stay in the same part of the country, and policy sort of rolls around, and yet again the homes weren't as sustainable as they should have been for a huge number of reasons.
When I'm using the term sustainability, I'm just acknowledging that the concept did come from the environmental field before everyone else picked up on it, particularly the financial boys. And you're right, I think in some ways, a resident in an estate isn't thinking about life cycle assessment or embodied carbon, but they are thinking about the combined heat and power and the fact that they don't have much control of it, didn't have much control over it for the 60s models that we had. I'm just wondering whether those kind of things have been taken on board, because given the efforts that we're trying to make on that front in terms of fuel poverty, it would be interesting to know what lessons have been learnt, at least for future estate regeneration, on combined heat and power systems where the tenant could only found out twice a year when it was being switched on or off, and they didn't have the flexibility of it. Are those kind of things being learnt, at least, Becky, in your experience? Just
I think for the latest, I'll probably defer to my fellow guests.
Russell and Stephen?
Well, you operate within the context, I keep saying. Southwark has part of its objective to try and develop the borough as a whole. So we have a planning department, they have policies, and the planning department has officers whose task it is to look at these questions and advise on the regeneration of specific schemes. So we would benefit from that. We were required to do environmental impact analysis prior to any regeneration, and that meant taking account of biodiversity within the locality. We had some traditional route lines of canals that we were able to sustain. There is a requirement to recreate green space used through the regeneration process, so that we would seek to improve the quality of the green space whilst we're working on it, and add to its diversity by retaining whatever you could of local species and the like, and use that opportunity to engage with young people in the whole business of creating a sustainable environment. So sustainability becomes, I think, an active issue within the process, and towards the end, we're also concerned about design. Part of ensuring a neighbourhood is not knocked down every 10 years because people don't like it, is trying to engender a sense that this is a community that you're happy to live within. And part of that is about good design. So we went to things like the iconic Peckham Library and the canopy that opens the space to the green and the like, which is the Southwark way of doing regeneration. As you benefit from this building itself, you will know that. But environmental impact analyses were undertaken, and the outcome of that helped to shape the eventual design of the areas in which people lived. We were also able to do work around latest technologies in building design to try to build in factors to do with reducing call on water, reducing demand for additional heating, and try to use modern building technologies in terms of the brick and the design used to try to reduce demand for resources which would negatively impact on the environment in general terms. So there was an element being made through it, but I'm not sure that is typical outside of Southwark. I'm just merely saying that it is within context of borough policies as a whole.
Was that the case in Islington?
Well, in Islington, I mean, certainly the new designs we in those, well, at that time it was eco. We built to eco good standards, and then later code level 3, some code level 4 houses we built to ensure they were up to in terms of standard, in terms of renewables and thermal efficiency and so on, and very much in terms of the improving the park. It was increasing the biodiversity of the park. So those factors played in, and the environmental impact was very considered very greatly. But I think stepping aside from that, what we're now seeing is increasing fuel poverty, and we're seeing some building designs which are very, very difficult to retrofit viably. We have an estate in East London which is very much built to local authority design. We inherited it. and it's a system, it's a sort of type of steel frame construction, infill panels and so on. We're now actually thinking about redeveloping the whole thing because the residents are just not able to heat it sufficiently. It was built with all electricity. To put gas in will be very difficult and very expensive. It doesn't lend itself to that. We looked at wondering whether to overclad it to put a thermal envelope over it, but that would be phenomenally expensive, and we couldn't get the grant funding to support that. And then you start to say, well, actually, viably, this is going to go, we know electricity costs are going to go up and up, the residents are going to get increasingly hard, and the problem is the residents are just not heating it sufficiently. When it was built in the 70s, electricity was quite cheap, people kept their storage heaters on, and the whole building stayed nice and warm. Now we have a situation where one resident will keep their heating on, the one next door won't, the one upstairs might, the other one doesn't. So you've got cold bridging problems across the whole of the fabric of the building, and that creates its own problem. So that's driven us, in a sense, one of the factors we're looking at, to say, actually, does it make sense to invest more money in this building or not, or should we actually think of redeveloping it? So I think, just to respond, I think what I'm saying is it's again picking up the points we keep making. There are a whole myriad of factors you take into account in trying to reach a decision, and this could be one that tips the balance. I mean, yes, I think that's.
Well, yeah, I have come across all the solid walls I think you're talking about, particularly in the old tenement blocks. And still historically around. I'm very surprised actually that they are still kept and maintained by various associations. Just coming to
and local authorities.
And local authorities. I think it's predominantly the associations. But anyway, just moving to other kind of considerations in refurbishing and demolishing. And it's in some ways the tax regime, I dare say, plays a part of that. I mean, to what extent is that a critical? Well, I mean, I think refurbishing properties still costs 17.5% VAT, and new build nil. I mean, there's a positive incentive there, isn't there, to do new build rather than refurbish?
I mean, again, I think that's one of the things we play into the debate. Really. When you're looking at the figures and looking at all the numbers, and with my finance colleagues, we're all looking at these things and saying, what's the judgment? And actually, that 20% makes a difference. And you say, actually, you know. And that plays in. I mean, the VAT regime is very complex. We have an estate of our own, a tenement type estate in West London, which we've decided is now well underway, a refurbishment programme. We've kept the structure of the buildings. They're attractive buildings, but they're 100 years old or more now. But the local authority were very keen that we kept the street facade and so on, and retained but we're putting infill. We're linking with modern buildings, so we're completely gutting the building essentially. But one of the issues there is about how the VAT, and that's been a really challenging one, because the new build elements are zero rated. The refurbishment of the existing is 20%. But if you change the number of units on each floor, then you can get away with it. So you have to then take tax planning advice on how you're going to do the design. So the design of the building is driven for a number of reasons, but now it's being driven by what is the most financially efficient in terms of VAT. Well, that doesn't make much sense, really, does it? It doesn't seem to me. But you know, but they're the regimes we have to try and work within. It's another of those issues and pressures that come across us.
I had some success in getting nil valuations on refurbishments, and it is a job and a half in itself. And it may be something actually that the Housing Committee wants to make a recommendation on about the VAT regime and how it can actually determine which options housing providers take when looking at estates. The final decision-making point, which hasn't really come up in the questioning that Darren and Stephen has asked, is about guarantees made to residents about security of tenure and rent levels. Stephen, what kind of reassurances must you have given to the residents in Market?
All I can say is that Southern Housing Group, my association, with a number of stock transfers across parts of London, and we firmly hold those guarantees. I mean, those guarantees are built into the offer document, and they're sustained throughout that residence tenancy in terms of rent and service charges and the other factors inside. We overly challenge and question if anyone does so. We make sure we continue with that. So
Is what you're offering the same as what a local authority could offer? Or is it equal and equivalent? Or?
I would say it's an equivalent offer. That's right. It's a equivalent offer. I mean, one of the. I mean, again, you see, if a stock transfer proposition came to us today, one of the issues is those guarantees and the whole affordable rent regime and the complexity of that. And whether financially they'd factor in, well, you should be charging it on affordable rents, but we've got to provide suitable alternative accommodation, therefore we've got to have a similar rent regime to what the residents have had. So that will play another complicated story into the debate, probably.
I'm sure that will come up with tenants, bring the tenants in. I don't know if there are any other perspectives on that front.
To add to that, interestingly, we've kind of written in guarantees on all of our stock transfers when they took place to maintain the social rent level for 5 years. And then 2 years ago, when the affordable rent regime came in, one of our stock transfer partners were suggesting that they would they wanted to convert some of the existing rents, because that was part of the new affordable housing development programme, to affordable rents, which again, we hadn't ever anticipated that as an issue, and certainly it would have been an issue for residents. So as a local authority, we said we wouldn't support that, but they needed to convert a certain number of their units to make their new builds stack up. So again, you could put in place guarantees, and we thought 5-year period was kind of okay, but when faced with that policy decision from central government, we then found we were confronted with something that we weren't anticipating. So, policy positions can change what you might anticipate going forward.
And Stephen, did you?
No.
Just following up Murad's earlier point on the decisions that St Lewisham and Barnet have taken. Do you undertake a full life cycle analysis, embodied carbon analysis in terms of the environmental considerations around refurbish or demolition?
Well, I don't know the detail. I know we do take account of all of the environmental factors. I do think, interestingly, there are some issues that have come to play around the points that were made by Stephen around combined heat and power. I think that isn't necessarily an issue in and of itself, but where you've got communal systems built in with that, it can be problematic. So, in fact, we're in the process of regenerating one of our estates, and in the first 2 phases, they've had combined heat and power put in. And I know a lot of the housing associations have said that actually it has to be at scale in order for it to work on a communal basis, and they've done a study on this which they haven't published, because it is written into London Plan, and therefore local planning authorities have to follow that regime. And there's some querying over actually how cost effective is it, and particularly for the residents at the receiving end of this and what their bills are. And I do think all the way down the line, the old-fashioned kind of communal heating systems have been a nightmare to manage, and over time residents have felt as though they don't have the level of control they would like to have. The heating and charges and water charges are exorbitant, and they want that level of control which they didn't have under the original communal heating systems. And even though they might be able to control it now, still there's a minimum charge associated with it, which kind of is too high, basically. I do think there's an issue also around the fact that we're trying to build things that will last for lifetimes and going on into the future. I think there's an issue around, I think, more of a need for our homes to be whatever we build to be more flexible than just going to be there for hundreds of years going forward. So the issue that was raised about actually it's difficult to retrofit some of the buildings that have been built. And if we look at the kind of old Victorian and Edwardian houses and the kind of loft conversion, basement conversions, extensions, etc., they've tended to be a lot more flexible than some of the kind of modern constructions that, in fact, it's very difficult to retrofit them and bring them up to a standard. So that kind of only options really turns out to be perhaps demolishing and rebuilding. I think there's a real issue as well that comes up repeatedly around UPVC windows, all of the stuff around making homes warmer, and then residents suffering from condensation. And, that comes up repeatedly, and we don't seem to have found the answer to that. So I think there are issues around looking at the kind of environmental sustainability of buildings, where we've tried to address certain issues to make them warmer, etc., less drafty, which has then resulted in other problems that residents then face, which we haven't quite, found the answers to yet.
Of course, there are problems like that, but listening to the earlier section, the financial considerations seem to be so powerful in terms of the finance that's available and so on in terms of a decision. A cynic may argue that as an authority housing provider, you choose you make the decision that you want, whether to refurbish or demolish, and then commission an environmental impact assessment to justify that decision that you've already made.
To be honest, I don't think any authority sits there and kind of conspires to make a decision and then implement it. I think, as we said earlier, there's lots of factors that come into play. Certainly as an authority, we kind of want to look at the financial elements and build into that all the considerations. But largely what drives a lot of these considerations is about, are places working? Have they had sufficient investment, to make them suitable places, individual units as well as places to live in for residents going forward? And a lot of that will be driven by residents themselves who aren't happy living there. And therefore the local authority is kind of faced with a situation where it's trying to look at, well, actually, how can we make these places work better for the residents who are living there and for future generations? And you then look at the options that are available. Some of that is driven by the funding pots that are available and government policy initiatives and having to work within those frameworks. But I don't think I've worked almost 30 years in social housing now. I don't think I've ever been in an authority where they kind of sit conspiring in a room saying, oh, let's kind of work out what we're going to do with this estate and demolish it. Let's demolish it rather than do anything else with it, without taking into consideration the wider issues that we've already spoken about earlier.
But we do recognise the huge financial constraints that you're under, which skew decision making sometimes towards one direction rather than another.
It's a complicated picture, and I think Stephen's already said it is about making numbers stack up as well as everything. You can't get away from that. It would be very remiss of us if we just started going, let's do this, and we haven't got the money to do it, and let's splash loads for either demolishing and rebuilding. I mean, there's been a lot of refurb done. The Decent Homes funding pot meant we were investing a lot in windows and doors and kitchens and bathrooms. And actually, now that we're in the era since self-financing for local authorities of proactive asset management, what you realise is actually the amount of investment over a 30-year period compared to the level of income coming in, actually you're spending far more. The income doesn't cover the costs. And, you would think, is that a sensible thing to do? Well, on certain assets, like sheltered housing for older people, it might be the sensible thing to do. But in order to make make the finances work overall, you might, think about, actually, is it worth continuing to throw good money after bad? We need to go out in certain estates where it's not a good idea to do that, and the place isn't working. You'll have a conversation with residents around what they would like to see and what the options are. So I don't think yes, there is you have to look at the finances of it, but it's not all driven by that.
Thanks. Come back to Darren, just thanks for contributing there. There's one decision that really hasn't come up, which I think does play a role in refurbishing or demolition. Decamp programs. That's a huge task in itself. It's not usually done by the people doing the development side or the spreadsheet inside. It's usually lumbered on housing management. How big a consideration is that in what estate regeneration occurs on our estates in London? Becky?
Well, I think it's a huge consideration because it's a gigantic management issue. It's a political issue. It's a social issue. It's a very, very big task. I think the one difficulty that everybody faces when making these decisions is trying to understand just how big that task is from the beginning, and what the unexpected difficulties will be. So I think in terms of the data that's missing when making these decisions, the actual financial cost of the whole decamp programme is hard to estimate. But there's another big issue, which is the social cost as well. And in the whole of British research, we don't have good enough information to really understand that. But it is something very important that needs to be taken into account. And again, there are risks and uncertainties there because decamp programmes often take longer than people thought, and people spend longer in difficult circumstances. And reflecting on that, this sort of question of the cost, how costs build up over time, there's a parallel gap, which is the cost to the local authority, the cost to society of the missing home years during the time, the gap between the homes last being let or people moving out and the new homes being finished. And there's a lot of home years involved in any demolition scheme. And obviously you can partly experience that through the costs of decamp and so on, but it's there's an issue for people who are outside the system as well, those who are in the queue, waiting to get into social housing or waiting for a transfer as well.
Yeah. It's a major issue in the packet regeneration process. Quite simply because people have rights. If they're not willing to relinquish those rights, then obviously it's a negotiated process, which could take a very, very long time. And if that happens, then it slows down the whole process. It adds to the social cost. It impacts on the throughput within the housing department generally. And therefore it has to be a factor which is managed very, very well to enable you to bring about the outcomes you want.
I'd be interested how often you had to, in those circumstances, use compulsory purchase orders.
Yes. Reluctantly, the authority had to seek compulsory purchase orders. And,
you don't need them for tenants.
Sorry?
You don't need compulsory.
No, I know, but the right to buy.
It's the right to buy it. Yeah. Yes. And it is a negotiated process. And as I say, people have their rights. You can get into sticky discussions about valuations. And again, all of that counts as time, which is equal to cost, and makes the process very difficult. I'm not saying I have an answer to it. I'm merely saying it's an issue that has to be handled.
Well, one of the interesting things I think I would say, because it was 7 years of my life, Marty Estate project, was that it's a modest, as I say, very modest size. But one of the criteria that we had to sign up to was that the residents want to stay on site. They did not want to be moved away. So hence this issue with the local park. So the local authority had agreed a planning brief which allowed us to build use some of the land in the park to build on. And at the end of the day, the park was reconfigured so it had the same acreage as before. And so, in other words, virtually all the residents only moved once from their old home to their new home. So the decanting was built into the whole structure the way you worked. that they'd seen, the residents there had seen other redevelopment projects where they said, look, we've watched over many years people being dispersed across the borough, across London. So all that, they put it quite neatly, so that social value just goes, disappears. They said, we've lived here many years, we are very happy living in this part of Holloway. We want to stay here. And so we had to build a whole programme on this phased programme of decanting straight from their old projects to their new projects. It meant doing some very interesting things in terms of building very close to their existing properties until they could move across and so on. But they tolerated that because they were watching their own buildings being built. But for me, it was a really very interesting project because it put a different spin to the whole thing. We were actually designing their new homes for them that they would move into. So when they agreed to the stock transfer, the ballot, they knew what they would be offered in terms of where they moved to. We weren't in the process of just sending them anywhere and then the right to return. They actually moved. And at 271, 235 families moved straight from their old home to their new home. We also had to, of course, buy out the leaseholders, and we were able to get through this without using compulsory purchase power. We retained them, but we didn't use them.
Okay, thank you. Well, very briefly, Becky, and then we'll...
Sorry, just very briefly. People have rights, and decant is very, very expensive. But this sets up an unfairness, perhaps, potentially, in the system, which isn't necessarily taken into account in decision-making, and that's between the people who just happen to be living there in the estate when the clock stops, and other people who might also have housing needs all around the borough who don't get guaranteed. So,
thank you. We'll move on to the consultation process now, and Nikki Gavron was going to lead on this, but unfortunately she's ill and has belatedly sent in her apologies. So we'll note Nikki's apologies, and I'll start the questioning on this. So, how are the options made public or consulted on in the refurbishment, demolition, regeneration schemes that each of you have talked about? Stephen and Genevieve. We'll start with Stephen.
Well, typically I just pick up on a point that Genevieve made earlier. It very rarely does in my experience, do tenants get... that initial piece of work which sets out the options is typically done, in the office, working through what you could do, and then you present those options to. So it's not asking residents what the options are, because typically you've got to bring the constraints to the party. But then you very much. I've not worked on a scheme where we haven't actively involved all of the tenants in the process, and very much. Russell's talked about some of the stuff that's gone on in Peckham. That's a case in point of a really good example of where things. So for example, on the Woodbury Down, when I was at Hackney, we trained residents in design so that they could then be a reference design committee. So that because you can't assume that the people on the estates have the skills, and why would they? Because it's not their area, to be able to help you actually design and develop those schemes. So you have to. So we do things like that. On the Aylesbury estate, we used a system where we actually said that almost like a game of explaining to residents, and all the residents, a lot of residents got involved in this, about if you want a community centre, that means you can't have this amount of, to play that sort of tune about, what community assets can the scheme afford, how much affordable housing can afford, what will that mean for the amount of private housing. So to try and because it's always you want to try and get away from the fact that, because we are experts as well, we're sitting here, we do everything in a black box and then just present the answer. It's very important, certainly on the schemes I'm responsible for, and I imagine that my colleagues would echo that, of trying to explain and bring the community with you on that journey and get the community to input into that process. Because it really is the point that I think Russell made well, which is you have to go with the grain. Because otherwise you're just going to create the same problems you think you're solving.
So your model is to go for a preferred option, but then to have extensive consultation on the detail?
On how that option would then manifest it. Typically that's... the
the option between should we just refurb this estate or regenerate is not that's a false dichotomy. As I said before, it never looks that black and white. So it's much more about what the blend is, what's affordable.
And you talked about the importance of taking the residents and tenants along the journey with you, and it being a joint sort of project and information sharing and so on. But to the extent you can, but what if residents simply take a different view from the providers, a fundamentally different view?
I mean, we have to be very careful here. We don't fall into traps. We talk about residences as a sort of an animate object. There is as many. On the Aylesbury estate, there are 2,500 households. And they've probably got 2,500 different opinions, and a lot of people just don't get involved. I mean, I think that's really important. I mean, in fact, one of the great challenges, and practitioners here, I'm sure will vouch for this, is getting the community to engage in this. So. You really have to go a long way to get involvement in that process because, first of all, they take a long time. That's the nature of these things. People get bored, cynical. Why doesn't that happen? You said this was going to happen. It didn't happen. Well, because of all the reasons we've discussed earlier. Policies change, markets change, politicians change. So keeping a level of engagement is one of the great challenges of actually taking people through large estate regeneration schemes or even smaller ones.
You must have had situations, given your experience, where a clear body of tenants and residents are taking quite a different view from how do you manage that?
I feel you're leading the question. I'm not sure where you want it to go. I'm just explaining. You consult, and you shape the scheme where you can in response to this. I don't think there's anything more I can say about that. I've not been involved in a scheme where there has been, and in fact it wouldn't be the case for the reasons I think Genevieve made earlier, that it's typically when you choose to regenerate a scheme, if I can go to the extreme, it has been a political decision. Because the politicians have responded to the community, the people on the estate who are simply not happy with the quality of that estate, and the response to that has been to seek to regenerate. It isn't an academic exercise where, and this is why I think you're looking for the data that isn't there. It's not a technical process where there's a lot of technical aspects to it, but it's not an academic exercise as to whether you regenerate or whether you refurbish. It's often, in my experience,
right. We will be hearing next month in July, and bring as many of your friends as possible, because we do want a packed session with lots of people inputting. But for this meeting, we do actually want to hear from the housing providers. But we do definitely want to hear from you next month, Stephen.
Just to say, and I could say what people want me to say. I'm just telling you how it works. And so what I'm saying is that I think because of we work in a political environment, we work in local authorities, we are responding. I do not know of an estate, and I challenge anyone to name one, which has been regenerated as an academic exercise. It has been in response to concerns typically about the quality of the build or the difficulties of maintaining that estate. I don't know that Woodbury Down would be a really good example of that. One of the biggest estates in London that is simply, you cannot continue to maintain a post-war estate which was built quickly and shabbily into the future. There was no other option but to regenerate that estate in any sort of, by any criteria, whether it's financial, environmental, or community sustainability, if I'm allowed to use that term in its broader sense. So it then became a question of how you did that, over what period, how was it designed, and that's where you very much actively, if you're doing your job well, and I think practitioners around the table would vouch for this, and Peckham is a really good example of that, where you actively engage the community in that process.
Genevieve, have you anything additional to add?
Just a couple of points, particularly around your point about have we ever been faced with residents not supporting something that is being proposed. And we've got a number of examples of that. And interestingly, if Lewisham is very proud of the fact that it feels it did a resident-led options appraisal back in 2004 when the options were first being looked at. And actually we've ended up with a very, very mixed market approach. So we had 7 regeneration schemes, 1 PFI, 1 ALMO, 9 stock transfers, including a community gateway model, which is the only one in London, which is a resident-led stock transfer type organisation. So a very mixed picture, and that was largely driven as a result of the consultation that was carried out around the options available. Now, that doesn't mean that in each of those instances all residents were supportive of the way that was proposed for going forward. And, you know, for example, as I've said, Excalibur started out as a stock transfer, the economic downturn kicked in, we then moved to regeneration type proposal, and you know, there's quite a vociferous group of residents on that estate that want to preserve what they've got. And but we've had to kind of take that on board and move with some of their proposals. We've had to renegotiate on some of the terms. Obviously, it's had to fit within an overall financial packet, an envelope, but we've kind of worked with our housing association partner to be able to deliver most of the things that the residents on that estate have wanted. And similarly, you know, we came back and done another recent almost options appraisal again in the wake of self-financing, when we had a limit on the borrowing headroom was only 44 million. We kind of did an assessment around what could that help us deliver. We know there's a need for more housing and a need for much greater investment than that £44 million borrowing headroom will allow us to undertake. So we did some financial analysis. We discovered that actually if we did a stock transfer, that we could access through a stock transfer about £390 million, much sooner than the limit on the borrowing headroom. So we could achieve a lot more within a 10-year period than if the ALMO stayed with the council. Now, we went through that discussion, and what came out of that is lots of kind of voting and lots of opinions and newsletters and steering groups and estate meetings and all sorts of things. And from that, actually, what came back was a sense in which the residents weren't fully committed to a stock transfer, so the council then rethought it and put it on hold and said, you know, for now it's not going to pursue that option, even though there's loads of money out there that might be available if we stock transferred. So a lot of these things, and the same with the Excalibur, we've gone back every time, we've taken a test of opinion. On the leaseholder front, we've always kind of given, on stock transfers, we've given leaseholders the right to express their views, even though legally it's not a requirement, it's only tenants that can be balloted, but leaseholders have also been given the right to express and to vote. And in that way, we've kind of revisited a lot of the proposals, and they've developed and they've emerged as we've gone through. But a lot of these decisions ultimately have been taken on the back of the majority of those voting supporting what the proposal is, and Excalibur Estate is definitely in that category. We've gone back lots of times, much more than has been required, to find out when there's been large opposition against certain bits of where we're taking it. We've gone back, we've retested the opinion, and when we've retested that opinion, it's supported the kind of view that we should go down the regeneration stock transfer route. So that's how we've kind of...
So you've got to adapt and change, is your...
Yeah.
Russell, any additional thoughts from Peckham experience?
Well, in the Peckham experience, the chapter on consultation is quite an important one, because clearly the council did not get it right in the first phase, and this is linked to the funding pot. 60 millions for a regeneration scheme to kickstart the process. 58 millions of that ring-fenced on housing. The other small amount to do community participation, involvement and change. Didn't get it right. However, actually, in the process of the regeneration itself, because there was a commitment to consultation, and the consultation, as Stephen was explaining, takes a number of forms so that you can get as broad a spectrum of contribution to the discussion, debate as possible, rather than, for instance, taking the views of the tenants and residents leaders as representative of the voice of the community. You use more polling, we used focus groups, we used workshops, we use ways in which people can come and help build the vision for themselves. You get a vision, everybody buys into the vision, but that's the start. Everybody wants to live in a more beautiful place that works constructively and delivers value. But then what happens is you get a diversity of views, which becomes very difficult to manage. So you use more polling, and throughout you make changes. And over the life cycle of the program, you will adapt what you are doing in response. Otherwise, the thing just won't work. So consultation is very, very much part of it. But it's not a straightforward process. There is no perfect model.
Thank you. And Stephen, are housing associations better at consultation on this than the boroughs?
I would never cast it as simple as that. I think again, it's far. Every case is different. I mean, just a small example I thought of Martin's Day, because it's just again, it's small, but it's interesting. One of the issues there was, as I mentioned, the council had agreed through very difficult discussions before we were involved to allow a supplementary planning brief to allow housing to be built on the local park, on the adjacent park. This then brought a huge concern from park users. Friends of the park were formed, a group was formed, in opposition. They said, why? And in various, it was almost a class battle then took place, because the users of the park said, that estate's been ruined because the residents have ruined it. If they'd looked after it, it could have been saved. You've wrecked it. And now not only do you want new homes, you want to take over our park, which is, in Islington, which has a shortage of open space. It's very important. So it was literally, we arrived in almost a class war between the two factions. In a very small way, but it was significant. So we had to work through lots of discussions over many months to try and agree a master plan that would compromise between the different parties. And we got there, but it isn't, I think the critical thing I think to say is there isn't one view of residents, there's not one view of the community, there's a whole range of various views which have merit in their different ways, and you're trying to find a path through that to have the end goal, which is we want to try and improve this area, we want to try and make it a decent place to live and live in going forward. And so the anvils of these very difficult debates can bring, you don't quite often know where the outcome might lead to, but you have to try and say, well, actually, everybody accepts there's a problem here. Do we all accept there's a problem? How are we going to get through it? And as I say, it's many, many hours in 2003 and 2004, we managed to hammer out a master plan that then was, in fact, all parties supported the planning application, went to Islington, so it was very positive in the end. But it took a lot to get there. Great.
Okay, thank you. And Becky, do clear guidelines exist in terms of consultation procedures, and would it help if...
Well, there are some legal requirements to consult secure tenants, and there are legal requirements as part of the planning process as to public consultation on major developments. There's an enormous amount of good practice literature. I think if you look at the countries around Europe which do considerable amount of demolition and rebuilding, particularly France and the Netherlands, Britain is really far ahead in terms of public consultation, taking it seriously and having expertise and using a wide range of techniques, and they're more available increasingly with IT and so on. And there are many consultation events that no one turns up to. People don't always want to.
Elections.
But nonetheless, I think it is. There is a continuing issue that in every redevelopment scheme there will be people who feel they haven't been consulted enough, or that they didn't get the right information, or the information kept changing. And to some extent this is inherent in the process, but I think it's worth continually striving to improve that. And another issue is that there will be people who feel at the end of the process that they didn't get, or residents didn't get, as much as they could have done. And that's a bit more difficult, because that's not just about brilliant techniques or having really great meetings. There is a sort of a fundamental issue about the aims of the whole procedure here. Is it the aim that every one of the existing residents will be better off, or is this about the borough? Will there be some losers? And those are some of the sort of key elements of the decision-making process that maybe aren't made as explicit as they might be. So it might be that there will have to be losers, and if you say that to people at the beginning, it will be easier to accept.
Sorry, Stephen, did you want to...
I just want to make a supplementary point, one that's been missed in the conversation, and that is, and we are now talking very much about regeneration rather than refurbishment. Consultation is talking to the people who are there, and one of the things that we really need to bear in mind is that the people who are going to be living in that place that you're building, only some of them are the people you're consulting. And I make that self-evident fact, but you need... we're quite keen, and we are beginning to use some surveying techniques to think about the people who are going to be moving into... Now, we're not going to know the individuals, but we're going to know the cohorts, and we're going to know the kinds of people, to start to sort of almost second-guess what we think they will want. Because, as I said, you can't consult them because they're not there.
Murad, do you want to...
Yeah, Stephen, I actually went to Colindale last week. And,
good for you.
I do go to the end of tube lines, like most people. Anyway, okay. I'll keep the tube jokes out of it then. But there was certainly a very large concern about the increased density proposed with the development there, with tower blocks and what have you. Now, I personally don't have any problems with increased density. I live in central London. As long as the density is managed well, I feel it can be dealt with. But it's quite clear in Colindale with the doubling of the density, it's over the GLA figures for density, for example, the tower blocks and what have you. The local residents haven't actually signed up to that, and that's not a very good case in the case of Barnet of actually.
Oh, that's interesting. You should say that. Let me respond to that.
That's what I was. That's what I said.
No. Well, this goes. This
goes to the heart of the issue,
because you've gone to the heart of things there, because that's the very point I'm making. So the people who are there for a reason, and they're either there out of circumstance, they got their allocation was Graham Park, or they've chosen to live in what are largely quite a suburban neighbourhood. And we are densifying it. This is a problem not just for Colindale, it's happening in if you went to places in Croydon or other places, this is what is happening in London. To be able to fit Birmingham into London in the next 10 years, we're going to have to go up, if we're going to keep it within the boundaries. And you're right, that gives people out in places like Colindale and Barnet generally concern. And if you, by and large, consult them, they will say, no, thank you, we don't want it. And that's classic sort of NIMBYism. But let me just go to the point you're making. If we want to accommodate and build more affordable housing, as well as all housing is affordable to somebody, but the kind of affordable housing we mean, we've got to find places to do it. And there's plenty of places to do it in Colindale. I think the interesting question for taking that challenge to places like Colindale is, how do you do that in a way that ensures that you leave a community when you finish the job? You haven't just destroyed a community. And that is a really interesting question which probably wants to detain this committee in its own right for a couple of hours. But I think that is something we are genuinely grappling with in Colindale. I don't want to be glib about that, because because the Met sold the Peel Centre, which I think is the site you're talking about. That's we've gone from no houses to 3,000 by the time it's built out. Is one of the kind of big issues we're dealing with in London at the moment.
Well, I dare say it's going to be an important bearing on the by-election there, but that will actually
we'll not deal with the by-election there. But Genevieve, in Lewisham, you're looking at densification on existing estates. not through demolition but through infill as part of the new round of council house building. Just want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, interestingly, we've made a commitment, council's building for the first time in 30 years. We've kind of looked at a range of kind of existing housing estates and sites. There's about 80 in total, and we're just working on the top 13 of those in order to infill and build more housing. Now, we've started in, a lot of this is kind of garage sites or kind of or just vacant spaces on the estates that could be better used. We've started building our first set of 6 homes, starting small. But interestingly, through those discussions, residents haven't really been anti the new infill. In fact, a lot of them have seen this as a positive opportunity, for example, on a derelict garage site, to kind of, deal with issues around antisocial behaviour or kids hanging out and stuff like that, and damage and fires, etc. Or they've seen it as a better opportunity to kind of improve the estate, because what we do recognise is that actually if you're going to infill, then you need to be able to offer the existing residents something as well. So, we've spoken to them about what they would like to see. Some of them haven't got balconies, they'd like to see balconies built onto their blocks, etc. And we haven't really found a kind of a NIMBY response, which is about saying, because there is a recognition, I think, that there is a need for more homes. There's also a factor around, actually, when these new homes are built, will some of the residents that live in the existing homes who may be overcrowded, will they be able to access some of these new homes and stay on the estate? So we're looking at local lettings plans, etc. We haven't developed any yet, because it does bring the tension which Becky has highlighted around the wider needs that you have as a local authority and competing demands. But nevertheless, that's something that we're prepared to look at, and we will look at it. So generally, I think residents have seen a lot of the estates, and we've spoken now, and we've got plans, we've developed the plans with local residents, with them saying, what they would like to see done in the area and the kind of height generally, adding on to existing blocks, putting lifts in, stuff like that. So it's generally been a positive discussion. We haven't had any backlash so far.
And it's fair to say that those plans haven't been politically controversial, have they?
They haven't,
in the borough?
no.
Yeah, that's interesting. Good. We'll move on now to financing, and Tom, you're going to lead on this.
Thanks, Chair. We've already touched on the main question to do with finance quite a lot, which is what are the main sources of finance available for both rebuild and refurbishment. I mean, we've talked about cross-subsidy, we've talked about councils financing via headroom and the potential for the borrowing cap to be lifted. We've talked about stock transfer. One thing that hasn't been talked about, which I know at least one housing association is in discussions about this, is institutional investment. I know of at least one housing association that's talking to pension funds about attracting investment. So I don't know, Stephen, whether that's something that Southern have been looking at.
Certainly, we've been in discussions about financing. I think these are complicated matters. You're looking at. The problem without grant coming in of any significant size, you've got to try and make schemes stack up. And what we're increasingly doing is having to, unfortunately, reduce the affordable element and increase the sale or market rented element. And so you're creating these quite complex projects, which financial institutions, I think, they have a problem getting their head around. It's not what they normally fund and so on. So I think there is some progress being made, but we aren't there yet, I don't think. But it's an issue that I think going forward we've got to try and work on. They are complex. They're complex issues, and I think there's great concern about if you're depending so much on private investors or people buying or renting the property, then the security of that investment, how strong is it? And it's interesting, I think, what's also happened because of the uncertainty about benefit and universal credit and all the rest of it going forward, that's creating another uncertainty in the process. So again, whereas a few years ago, well, that's all right because it's almost governed back the income, that's no longer the case. It's weakening that area. So I think there's a whole range of issues still changing there.
I don't know, Genevieve and Stephen, whether from a local authority perspective this isn't attractive. The idea of institutional investment is something that you've explored.
It's we've kind of been looking at lots of different kind of funding regimes, really. We're looking at various vehicles that we can do, either set up as a local authority. We're getting lots of advice around it. We're looking at things for our Almo. Can they, if they build, etc. And is there access to finance? Can we create a company out of them to enable them to build? There's a big issue. One of the biggest issues affecting, I think, any of these kind of, whether it's regeneration or new build sites independently of regeneration, and it's about right to buy. And the huge increase in right to buy, and therefore the viability of the business going forward. And so, some of the vehicles we're looking at is about, actually protecting from right to buy, because that kind of does affect the financial issues and sustainability of the business case. So we're looking at joint ventures, we're looking at, we've had umpteen institutional investors come to speak to us who are interested in developing private rented sector housing. And again, we're kind of exploring that as well.
I think Enfield have set up a wholly owned company to deliver essentially council housing, but it gets around the right to buy issue because they're not eligible. Is that something that you've looked at?
It's not. And we're in the very active process of looking at that. But that's with our Almo, creating a limited kind of sub-company to be able to do that. But you can't set that up just to protect the new homes from right to buy. It's got to be something other than that. So we're being quite careful about what we're setting up and for what purpose we're setting up these vehicles. But there's loads of issues around the financing of all of this going forward, whether because although the private rented sector has become quite sexy in the recent period, there is always the issue of the affordability of it, which is paramount, and there is the security of tenure issue. Those are the two critical issues. Now, security can probably be addressed. You can get longer term tenancies through institutional investment. I think that's welcome. It doesn't necessarily address the affordability factor, and the households that local authorities need to house that are on our waiting lists, etc., generally can't afford full market rents. So, there's lots of pressures around how we can work with various partners to produce the full range of housing that's needed. But the most critical at the moment, in my estimation, is the need for more truly affordable rented homes for those most in need, on lower salaries, and also intermediate salaries where people can't access the home ownership market. And unfortunately, this is my personal view, it's not Lewisham's view, but I still think there is a load of focus on helping people into home ownership, and there's a vast number of schemes to help with that. It gets a lot of people into trouble who kind of enter into the home ownership market when they can't really afford it. So I think kind of having more truly affordable rented housing is an important focus that we should be looking at, and that isn't getting enough attention. But we're looking at all sorts of vehicles.
I can see Russell's nodding on. Do you have anything to add on that point? Or?
Well, it's a bigger issue. The current housing model that we're locked into is not likely to work going forward because affordability is increasingly becoming an issue for many of the residents of London. And wearing my social inclusion hat from Greenwich, I can see that many of the members of the black and ethnic minority communities who ought to be able to access decent housing are having difficulties because affordability is not necessarily something which everyone can enjoy at the moment. Authorities are locked into a housing model which is latched onto the sorts of financial packages that we've been talking about. And there is a concern in the housing press at the moment that if issues happen around the right to buy and if issues happen around, I suppose, income levels within London, people are not going to be able to buy up all of these houses that they're supposed to be buying going forward. So the model at the moment is heading into jeopardy, and that will have an impact on whether or not every member of the community can have the right to decent housing in the way that we keep talking about. So it's a much bigger issue that we're able to talk through. And at present, I think, we're locking ourselves into a model which might not work for the future.
So let's say the government turned around and said we're going to lift the borrowing cap to free up councils to have a much more greater ability to finance both refurbishing and new housing themselves. How would that change, I mean, maybe Stephen, how would that change your approach to the whole question of rebuilding versus refurbishing?
Well, perhaps I could answer the question slightly differently. I think there was a lift on the I mean, at the moment, Barnet is actively, like Lewisham, and I think Hackney, when I was there as well, now got a council house building programme. Okay, it's all fairly small scale at the moment. We're all putting it, because one of the things that's gone out of local authorities is that skill base. There are very few people like us who do that stuff, who can actually build things, because they stopped building in the 80s, and so that skill set has left the sector. So building up teams who can actually do development has been one of the challenges of actually meeting. So in the moment, we actually don't need, in the case of Barnet, we don't need more money, we need more skills to be able to do the things that we need to do. In time, we'll reach our limits, but that's not, that's Barnet's situation, I'd be saying, across all boroughs. I don't think it'll change the question about whether we move towards more refurb, I think the question, that's not it will allow us to do more. I don't think it'll switch necessarily whether we go for refurb or not, because you don't want to, because the same arguments will apply. You do not want to throw, and I know we've used this and it's been debated, good money after bad. If you've got stock that isn't fit for refurbishment, you shouldn't be throwing money at it. And that was the one I said very early on in this session. Some of the clunkiness about decent homes was, thou shalt put a new bathroom, thou shalt put a new kitchen, thou shalt put windows in. All well intended, but like unintended consequences. We've ended up spending good money on buildings that perhaps we should have thought differently about. And I think we're more sophisticated than that, and should be allowed to be more sophisticated. So I think before we need to start looking at new funding sources, we've actually been given quite a bit of flexibility in the last couple of years, and through the way the changes in the HRA, and that's, I think, given us the opportunity to start flexing our muscles in ways that we haven't been able to do before, and certainly welcome. And I just think we need more of it to be able to do more. But it does go back, and I think because I only ever speak after you, so I keep quoting you, but I think you're saying the same things I would do. That fundamental equation that Genevieve talked about at the beginning, that has sort of kind of driven us all, is there is a gap between how much we have to spend and how much we need to spend to get the stock, whether it's through refurb or regeneration, up to scratch. And that hole remains. It's not as bad as it used to be. Decent Homes did a lot to bridge that gap, but it still exists. And so we will always be trying to find ways to form that gap. And I think, notwithstanding, we may, people in the audience and yourselves may have differences of opinion about how we do that. The fact that local authorities, by and large, are attempting to do that, I think, is and you'll just see people playing different tunes around that. 33 boroughs in London, you'll see 33 different variations of that.
Well, perhaps I could move on to stock transfer, and obviously, the housing associations these days are also facing quite a lot of financial pressures? How valuable is stock transfer?
I'll make two comments if I can respond to that. Stock transfers, I think, well, they've lost their appeal from a local authority point of view for obvious reasons. There's no money attached. They were never particularly popular. It was interesting. You talked about your example. I've gone through several of them. Ask people what they think about the council as a landlord, and they'll complain like hell. Ask them if they want another landlord. On the other hand, I'll leave you with that. So that does, and so it's one of those. I always find that quite endearing in a way that we might be bad, but we're not as bad as the other guys. And although that is, of course, what you don't know. And one of the things I would say that Stephen will respond to this, I'm sure, but RPs, registered providers, have actually a large. They've got big asset base, as do local authorities, and that we have actually got a lot of potential borrowing power. So I think part of the solution looking forward, if it is we have to use our own stock and our own resources to fix this problem, then it will be about freeing up the use of that and how much risk local authorities and RPs as acting in the same capacity are prepared to take. And again, that's quite an interesting question, and I think you'll get a variety of answers to that. But I think we've got to be careful we don't end up being part of the problem. We don't want to end up fueling the bubble, because the more we spend in housing, the more housing gets expensive in London.
Would you agree with that assessment? Stock transfer specifically as not being particularly attractive?
Well, interestingly, when we looked at the recent options appraisal we did for the Almo and the access to the 390 million as opposed to the 44 million, it was an attractive option, obviously, in terms of being able to deliver a lot quicker. And I think that's what's critical in a lot of this. It's about how quickly you can deliver either refurbishment programmes and improving in existing homes and estates and places, etc., and build new housing versus, if you wait with the borrowing cap, etc., it's going to be like 20 years as opposed to 10 years. So you've got whole generations growing up from kids and finishing school, etc., living in, not very good conditions. And is that what you want to subject, our residents, our communities to? And that was the kind of logic behind really our consultation on that possible option. So I think and one of the things when we were looking at that is the kind of some of the estates just don't work financially. There's a gap there. So that gap funding, the support for it, was quite critical. And what we were demonstrating to government is actually they'd get a bigger return in the VAT. That question came up earlier. So in fact, all they were doing was investing to save. By gap funding and enabling the stock transfer to happen, they were seeing it as millions of pounds wasted. In fact, what it would have done for government and for the country as a whole is bring in more VAT receipts, enable more work, etc. So I think there is still a case, actually, but it's got to be around, actually, do residents want that? Do they support it? And there is that age-old issue about a lot of the time residents don't want it. They would prefer to stay with the local authority as a landlord and have everything done that they need to be done on their estates. But we can't do that, and we don't necessarily have the resources to
Presumably
do it.
there's the question of tenure as well. I mean, you mentioned earlier about, was it 5 years that you said? So presumably a lot of residents will be very concerned about the fact they'll be switched over eventually from a lifetime tenancy to a much shorter tenancy.
Well, that is usually guaranteed with stock transfer, not necessarily for the new tenants that then come into
the existing tenants.
The existing tenants will preserve their lifetime tenancy, etc. But a lot of those, the rent levels in the housing association sector tend to be higher. Residents fear that. They fear for their security of tenancy, etc. So a lot of that is about an educational process of taking tenants through, that kind of what their rights are and what they retain, etc. They do lose the right to buy, but they've got a right to acquire, which is much less discount. Well, they don't lose it as existing tenants, but future tenants as well. So a lot of the the housing association conditions that apply for new tenants that come in rather than the existing tenants. And existing tenants don't often realise, they kind of retain essentially the right to buy. So a lot of their fears are kind of, unfounded fears, but nevertheless, if they're also thinking about their children, etc., then that might affect their way of thinking. So I think there is still a case for stock transfer if that gap funding was available. And I think it needs to be looked at in the wider financial context. I think essentially, if you look at if the borrowing headroom, if there was no cap on the borrowing headroom, local authorities could do and achieve most of what you'd achieve by stock transferring.
Yeah.
So that there's no doubt about that, and you could achieve it in a shorter time frame. Yeah. So there's no doubt about that either. So I do think that is quite a critical issue. And I think, most residents, their instinct is to stay with the local authority as well, rather than to stock transfer or go down that route.
Can I ask about the regeneration fund, which is the new £150 million which the government has announced? To all three of you, really. I mean, will you be bidding for it, and what would you hope to use the funds for if you are successful? I'll start with Stephen.
This is an area really is not my expertise. I'd much prefer you answer this to others' questions.
Okay.
Because I don't think it's directly related to what we're doing.
Sure.
Well, the news we got on this regeneration fund, yes, we would have been very keen to bid, but we understand it's for existing regeneration schemes that have stalled, and it's for larger schemes that they want to target the funding at. Can I just say it's absolutely negligible? If I was, I look at all of our regeneration schemes. One of our estates, we're doubling density from 565 to 1,192. The overall investment needed for that is 230 million. So that's for one estate. So,
And there's 150 million nationwide.
Yeah, exactly. So, you're not going to change the kind of world by bidding for that funding pot. But yet, generally, local authorities want to bid for whatever funding pot becomes available, to be honest, because you want to maximise resources and kind of do the best you can. So long as you're not tied to something. I would just add this as well. I think the range of funding that comes out from central government has got so many complexities tied up with it that in
fact... Strings attached.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just like, please, and the point that was made earlier about